Welcome, everybody, to the Chats with Yvonne podcast, where we dive deep into the art of public speaking. I'm your host, Yvonne Podcast, and I love public speaking, and I want to help you love it too. This space is a safe space for you, it's for me, and it's for anyone that has once been afraid to public speak. I have a deep belief that tells me everyone is already great at public speaking. We just haven't heard it enough. We just haven't seen us on the big stages enough. We just haven't been given enough of the opportunities to showcase or cultivate our public speaking skills. Now, I have to preface this with sharing the identities that make up who I am because they impact the topics that I cover on this podcast. Soy Latina. I am first gen, Chicana, born in California. My mom is from Guanajuato, Mexico. Oldest daughter to my brother and sister. I'm an ambivert, meaning I'm an introvert that also has extroverted tendencies. I'm a Cancer, if that means anything to you. And I care deeply about people. Really, I love people. And yes, I'm human, so some people irritate me. But at my core, I care about people. Part of getting to a place of love with public speaking is understanding why we don't love it. Sometimes the art of public speaking can make us feel like we have to be something that we're not. That's why this podcast dives into who we are as people to uncover how to start or continue our relationship with public speaking. Because it really is a tool for success in whatever way you define that. In this segment, we dive into the saying, Calladita te ves más bonita. And I'm doing my best to translate the sentiment here, but it means something like, you look cuter when you're silent. It's a type of phrase you could be told in Latinx, Latina households if you ever tried to speak up or even ask a question, usually directed towards the girls of the house. To understand how this impacts how we show up as public speakers, we'll hear experiences from a couple of different people throughout the episode. I asked some of my community members to share their thoughts or connections to the phrase, Calladita te ves más bonita. I didn't provide too much of a guidance because I wanted them to simply share their thoughts, sin filtro. You'll also meet Enzo, a first-gen college graduate from a single-parent home, trans and queer Latinx, who is interested in the remembrance, documentation, and archival of cultural practices, an artist, community worker, an advocate, and currently switching fields from nonprofit work to digital marketing. They're a badass. Before we meet Enzo, thank you to every single one of you for trusting me with your stories and your experiences. I deeply appreciate you and thank you for sharing a bit about you as we engage in this collective learning experience. All right, Enzo, tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, my parents are separated. They, first and foremost, they separated when I was really young. They've probably been separated longer than they were together by now. But yeah, I originally was born in Lompoc, California, which is on the Central Coast. And after my parents split up, we lived with my mom, my younger brother, and I, which resulted in us moving around a lot. Just sort of, she was young and trying to figure life out. And so we were kind of along for the ride with her until we settled in Santa Barbara. Which is like a beach town, very nice, very sunny. And so that's where I tell folks that I'm from. But for the most part, when that phrase, it's hard to say, because I tell people in a lot of ways, my mother transgressed those like cultural expectations, right, of what it means to be a Latina, right? Like when my parents separated, it was very like, very gassed, like how, and whenever we moved into new neighborhoods, it was very much like, oh, like, like, es mujer soltera con niños, like, like, hide your husbands. And I'm like, girl, she don't want your ugly ass man. But, while my mother transgressed, right, machismo and like those cultural expectations of what it means to be a woman, she herself in certain ways perpetuated as well, right? Like the first time I heard that phrase, it came from her. And I think a lot of the times, that phrase came up when I was simply trying to advocate for myself, right? Or say something in disagreement, right? Where I'm like, this doesn't feel right, and I'm going to speak up.
Hi, my name is Katie Hernandez, and I'm a grad student at Dominican University of California. Growing up, I was always outspoken, and if something or someone was bothering me, I would speak up. Eventually, it got to the point where nothing was being done about my concerns or ideas. And my mom got tired of me voicing my issues about someone bullying me, and I was the one getting in trouble for saying something. So my mother eventually told me, Calladita te ves más bonita, meaning that if I stayed quiet, it would go away and nothing would happen. Today, when I hear that, I think about all the times that I stayed quiet and my voice wasn't heard. As the only girl of 4 kids, I always spoke up, but eventually got tired of it. So I stayed back and calladita más bonita. Today, I try my best to speak up because I was so used to sitting back for so many years that I have a hard time today trying to voice my questions, concerns, or ideas. But at the end of the day, as a young Latina, now una también se puede ver bonita hablando.
And of course, it's very complicated, right? My mother and I have a complicated relationship, especially, with the intersections of being queer and trans and, having, right, the opportunities that I have due to my parents' sacrifices, right? But yeah, a lot of it was also solidified by my own father, right? Like my father, he I love him to death. Definitely I was a daddy's little girl growing up. But as I got older, right, these cultural expectations of what it means to be a señorita, of what it means to, like not only were the expectations of me to go to college, but like I also had to be, learn how to cook and clean and, right, abide by these unrealistic standards, right? And I just never, and I think constantly being surrounded by like patriarchy and machismo always made me a very vocal advocate for myself, right? Like while my parents said this to me, I was always being like, no.
I don't have a specific memory of when I was first told, Calladita te ves más bonita. But I do remember when I first understood and received that message. And that was when I was in elementary school. I remember realizing that if I was quiet and helpful and conformed and followed all of the rules, did exactly as I was told, that I would be praised and rewarded. But I didn't understand the cost at that time, the needs that I was not having met, because I didn't know how to voice them. And it's been a journey in learning how to really express my needs, how to set those boundaries. And it's something that I work on every day. And in my job as a psychologist, it's what I work on with others to help them really understand the power of their voice. Because calladita, no nos vemos más bonitas.
Right, my parents came here, right, from another country. My mom is an immigrant. My dad is a refugee. And right, while we were raised with like the culture, right, at home, within the home, outside, right, like going to school, talking to friends, right, talking to my white friends, right, and being exposed to things via the internet, especially when I came into adolescence, right, and the feelings that I had, right, the anger, the frustration, I've come to know that that was just a signal at some type of injustice, right? If I had to stay inside and fold the clothes, but my brother got to play outside, like I'd be like, why? Like, what's going on? Like, why can't I play outside? And so it was a mix of all things. It was a mix of like those feelings of frustration, of anger. And it was also a mix of like, when teachers tell you like you can be whatever you want and like blah 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 and like and I'm sure we've all seen those skits of like when you go over to like your white friend's house and they're like she can't talk to you like that, dude, like it's a mutual respect, like blah blah blah, like those things like that. And it's like they're not understanding the cultural expectations and dynamics, right, that we as like brown folks have to navigate a little differently. And also at that time, right, I was spending a lot of time on the internet. I was coming of age, right, and I was, not only was I different from the other kids because of my class status, but also, right, because of my queerness, both in my sexuality and my gender. And so I was spending a lot of time on the internet. And at that time, Latina Rebels was, up and coming. And I was like, I was learning about like white feminism and about like machismo and like, um, right, like sort of what it meant to be a woman of color navigating institutions and being present within our culture, within the home.
I can't recall one certain moment where I remember hearing Calladita te ves más bonita. However, I do think of a lot of instances where I had to call my parents out on things they said or they did or how they felt. Obviously, I love my parents so much, but it's hard for them to unlearn such toxic ideas of what women and men are supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do. And I'm the eldest daughter, I'm the only daughter, and I have two younger brothers. And the inequalities between us is tremendous. I remember when I was a teenager, I wasn't allowed to go out. If I did, I had to bring my little brother or somebody else. And I was just told that I had different household responsibilities than my brothers. And as I grew up, I reflected on these things and I asked myself why my brothers and I weren't responsible for the same things. Why was I taking on another responsibility that was sort of mom like? I was parenting and I began to get really frustrated. And so when I was able to understand the complexity of these things, I would call my parents out. I would say, no, this is not okay. I'm not just going to be okay with doing all of the chores by myself because we're a household together. We're a family. We should distribute the labor equally, right? And I think I was never explicitly told que calladita me veo más bonita, but I was also not encouraged to speak my mind and challenge ideas. And so I'm sure I was, in my parents' view, some type of trouble because I was not going to keep going with these gender inequalities. I was going to say something about it. And that's how my parents raised me. They told me to speak my mind and to stand up for myself. And I guess when it came full circle to standing up for myself in my household and against my parents, that's when they were like, wow, can't be mad at her because that's what we taught her. And so I definitely resonate with all of the ideas of how hard it is to be the eldest daughter of immigrant parents. I know our parents want the best for us, and it's hard that sometimes we can't see eye to eye, but calladita no nos vemos más bonitas, right? We need to speak our minds and really just fight for what is just, even if it's in our households, within our families. We need to challenge these toxic ideas of what Latino culture is because they are not beneficial to men or women.
I talk about all these external influences, but I think realistically, the right me learning how to advocate for myself and like, I said, be like cabrona came from my mother. It is very much it's an ironic twist of fate, right? Where it's like these expectations, cultural expectations that were placed on me, um, were right coming from my parents, coming from my mother. And at the same time, right, my mother was exemplifying how she was transgressing these boundaries and blurring the lines, right? Because the first memories I have of any woman advocating for herself would be my mother. Right? And she is a very fierce woman. You can definitely sense when she walks into a room. She's bold, she's loud. She's also humble, she's funny. And she speaks her mind, right? She's very extroverted. And so I learned that from her, that fire, right? And so yeah, I think when I think about advocating for myself, when I think about having that fire, that passion, I very much embody my mother, which is very, like you said, very, ironic.
When I think of Calladita te ves más bonita, I think exactly the opposite. Calladita no more. Because this powerful statement reminds me to exert my voice even if it shakes, because there's still a lot of work to be done for women representation and equality. Our voices are powerful, especially when we elevate our voices to conversations that matter to us the most. Calladita no more.
As a single mother navigating these systems and institutions, right? Like, I need food stamps, I need to feed the kids, right? I need to make rent, I need to, yeah, like, right, doing it all. And right, and my mom didn't finish high school. My mom has an accent when she speaks English. Right, like, people very much undermined her. And I used to get embarrassed that she was always angry and yelling. Right? Like, in these public spaces, right? At the fucking, like, welfare office, at, like, this grocery store or whatever, or like with the landlord. And I'd be like, come on, like, just let it go. Like, like, whatever. And she'd be like, no, right? Like, if she didn't do that, then we wouldn't have had food. Then we wouldn't have had a place to stay. So I'm like, I used to get embarrassed, right? At those sort of like loud expressions of anger and injustice. And now I appreciate them.
The memory that activates in my mind when I hear Calladita te ves más bonita, for me, it basically translates into just shut up, sit in the back, your opinion doesn't matter here. You're better off just being quiet. That's what comes to mind when I hear that. And the memory that it activates for me is actually being told that I have no say in anything. So that is a memory that activates in my mind. My opinion does not matter when I know it does.
I mean, it's hard to say, because I think I felt different, and I knew I was different, but I just didn't have the language for it, right? I didn't know how to articulate that. And so in some ways I was like, okay, I'm going to abide by these cultural expectations, right? Para hacer una buena, like, señorita, right? To not only go to college, but like, right, find a husband and like raise a family and all these things. I don't know, but in some ways I also felt like those rules did not apply to me, because I sort of knew innately that wasn't going to be my destiny. It is a continuous process. But I would say, right now, as I'm in my late 20s, right, I'm sort of deconstructing, right, and unpacking all of those memories, those instances, and keeping, right, what I find valuable, and also recognizing, right, the harms as well. Yeah, and knowing what I can take and what I can let go of. Culture reinforces power, right? And that doesn't mean we have to entirely abandon, right, our culture, right? Especially as Latin folks, we very much hold, right, certain things near and dear to us. But I think when we have these conversations about machismo, about, what it is to how we treat women and femmes, right, within our families, within our communities, the sooner we can shift that culture away from reinforcing those type of power dynamics.
This is interesting, right? Giving thought to the idea that there's so many beautiful parts of our culture. And at the same time, those very things can be unlearned and unpacked to discover how they've actually come into play into who we are as people and how we show up in the world. When I give some thought around the women that have inspired me, I always think about women that asked for what they needed, that spoke up, que no se quedaban calladitas, right? That's my mom. That's my English humanities teacher in elementary. That's Miss Brown. That's Abby. That's people that I specifically can recall being very outspoken. That's my best friend Rosie, my best friend Avalon, Ashley, all of my friends. Actually, I'm surrounded by badass women that speak up when something is wrong or when they don't agree with something. Jerica, Bojangles, Ty, Eileen. I am surrounded by badass women. And even those that couldn't escape that hard-ass script, that machismo, and that phrase, calladita te ves más bonita, had on them, I admire them too. Imagine enduring the burden of cultural expectations passed down from generation to generation and the strength that is needed to not cuss somebody out every single day, all of the time. There's strength in that. And I can admire that resilience too. I want to draw some connections to this phrase, calladita te ves más bonita, having heard the lived experiences of many of the people that were on this podcast segment and connected to public speaking. Why did I even decide to have this segment, particularly as we focus on the lens of public speaking? Well, for many reasons. One of those being the actual phrase, calladita te ves más bonita, has oftentimes discouraged us from speaking up. Or when we have spoken up, we've met with resistance. We've been told, no, don't do that again, please. And whether we like it or not, that kind of gets to you, right? As many times as you're told no, it can get to you. So the reason I wanted to bring it up is because when we think about as Latinas, as people in the Latinx community, about using our voices, how our culture literally impacts the way that we show up in the world. The people we love are typically the ones that teach us how to exist in the world. Our moms, as we saw today, play a huge role. And I wanted to touch on this topic because a lot of the unlearning starts at home. It starts within. It's why I have an affirmations podcast that asks us to also reflect. When I think about the art of public speaking and why for so long I've been intimidated, yes, there are external factors like the fact that there are systems that just don't create opportunities for women, for Latinas, right? And me seeing just white men or really bold, loud people on stages not being reflective of who I am personally and who a lot of us are. But also on the other side, it's the internal factors. So it's always like we're fighting two things all at once, two battles, right? All at once. Internally in La Casa, this is just as important to analyze in how we show up as public speakers. Part of my framework is reflect, connect, share. This reflection piece is so important to us as public speakers. When I think about the impacts, Aide mentioned she never had explicitly been told to stay calladita, but implicitly those things were there. Those things were part of our culture. And so how does that impact the way that we have the confidence to show up in spaces that already don't look like us, that already make us feel like we don't belong? If we're in our homes and in our own culture, we're like, wait, I know I belong here. I know here, these are my people. And even there, we feel like maybe we can't use our voices. Now imagine what it's like when we go out into the world, into college, into these conferences, these research conferences, what that feels like. So it starts with us unpacking all of these things and unlearning them at home to really find who we are and how we want to show up in the world. One of the things that Dr. Lisette said, she said, following the rules and you'll be rewarded. That's what calladita te ves más bonita sort of meant to her. That's how she experienced it, right? But what happens when you don't fit in? Enzo touched on this. When those rules are just out of alignment with who you are. This is the same concept that I talk about when it comes to public speaking. Sometimes public speaking feels like it asks us to be less of who we actually are on a daily basis, right? You have to show up real proper. You have to look this certain way. You have to wear that blazer. You have to look people straight in the eye, whatever it is. Don't move your hands a lot because then you'll look like a clown, right? But what if we could make public speaking a space that didn't make us feel that way, that actually embraced exactly who we were, and that, yes, we have the tools to make sure that our message is powerful, but that the lack of confidence from public speaking doesn't come from who we are or how we're showing up. Sure, maybe we can say, hey, I lack a little bit of confidence in this particular knowledge area, so you can become an expert at that. It doesn't matter, you can learn that stuff. But dealing with the more personal, with the confidence side of things, that takes a little bit more time. And then Enzo mentioned something that I thought was so funny, not funny, but so I went to middle school with white kids. I was intimidated, but it ended up being one of the moments in my life that gave me permission to be in a weird way. Not that a white space allowed me to be myself per se, but rather that I got to experience what it was like for others to be able to do that, like be themselves without feeling guilt, without having to worry about how your own actions could impact your family. I was in middle school. It's when I realized even then I was never really a kid. Like, sure, I would play out in the streets with my neighborhood friends, but I also had to prepare to get my brother ready for school the next day or make my little sister's bottle. And it's so, I realized when Enzo said, you would see, I would see my white kids and they would talk, or the white students, they would talk back to their parents. And I was like, ooh, I could never do that, right? How many times have we seen those memes where it's like, shut up, bitch. And you're like, ooh, what? Hell no. I can't even fathom the idea of talking to my mom like that. I would get slapped right away, which is not a good thing, right? But that's just how it is. And I realized that becoming, not only was it sort of an uncomfortable feeling to go into almost an entirely white space uh, for many reasons, but at the same time, it gave me a perspective on how other people see the world, and that the way that I was experiencing the world wasn't the only way. The way that I was experiencing it, and that my peers were experiencing it from my neighborhoods and my, also single mom, single ran households, that it wasn't everything that existed, that there was more. And that, I think, was the moment where I realized that this was this was embedded within me, but that maybe I could unlearn some things, right? Unlearn the things that didn't benefit me. I didn't envy, but I craved what my white friends had, which was the liberty to just be, to just exist, to just be kids, right? And that in and of itself was a huge privilege. And I think that that specifically brings us back to public speaking, because when we go out and see actually the opportunities that exist within the industry of public speaking, that you can get paid thousands for minutes of your time, that is baffling. That still to this day blows my mind. And it's something that I want us and my community to be exposed to. Because how often are we asked to go out there and talk about our experiences without getting compensated for it? Like that, no, like basta. Basta ya con eso, right? And I want us to understand and know that, hey, that exists. That is something that we could do, whether it's a little side gig, whether you want to do it full time, whatever it is, you could do that. And you can make really good money off of it. And of course, it's not about the money, but it's about this like just liberating feeling that is knowing that you don't have to be a lawyer, you don't have to be a teacher, a doctor to be successful. And then I said something too, where she said the distributing of labor, right? She was never, again, as I mentioned, she was never explicitly told, hey, Calladita te ves más bonita. But there were these, she was also discouraged from speaking up, even though that's what they taught us, right? They taught us to speak up and to defend ourselves. When we did it to our parents or to them, it's like, no, not to us, to the world, but not to us. It reminded me of, I never wanted to learn how to cook, and I have always acted like I just don't like it, because that was one way that I could be like, no, I'm not doing this solely on the fact that I'm a girl and my brother gets to go take out the trash. I want to go outside and take out the trash, get some fresh air, shit, right? It reminds me of this situation because now I'm like, wow, cooking is an actual just skill set that you should have, right? Not something that, and though in our cultures it made it seem like that was my little form of resistance as a little girl, right? That was the one thing that maybe I could just refuse to do, because everything else out when I went out into the world, it wasn't necessarily like that. And now, as I'm learning to actually cook and to really cultivate my love for cooking, because one, it feeds me, it feeds my body, right? But at the same time, there's so many cool things that you could do with it. And I'm learning that actually the process of learning how to cook and, the art of it, because it is an art, is very much like the art of public speaking. You have to put ingredients together. You have to present your food to somebody else, right? Like that's your audience. You have to think about how are they going to perceive it. It's so funny. Like I love it. I love the connections that I'm making within it because they're both a learning process. So as I'm learning how to cook, I'm also helping other people learn how to become even more of a badass public speaker. And so I'm seeing these connections there and realizing that, hey, maybe this recipe says you have to use this exact measurement of peppers or this exact measurement of milk, whatever it is, whatever recipe you're cooking, but you want a little bit more milk. You want to add a little bit more of the peppers because you want some chile in there because you like the spice. It's the same thing with public speaking. I always talk about foundational knowledge in the area of public speaking, but then you being able to bring yourself to it. And that's what makes it special. That's what makes whatever you're saying stick. And Enzo said something about learning how to be a cabrona came from my mother. Same, right? How many of us can relate to that? Ponte perra, my phrase, my most favorite phrase and affirmation, is inspired by my mother. My first memories that I have of women advocating for themselves is my mom too. So thinking about how the same people that maybe felt like they needed to, because they learned it from their mom and their mom and their mom, they needed to say, hey, just do this. This is what we do. At the same time, they themselves were advocating for themselves. They didn't realize that they were showing us how to exist in the world that way too. In my conversation with Enzo, I mentioned that it's so interesting because, when you're in your room and you're practicing public speaking, you're in front of the mirror. This is you. This is the most you that you can possibly be. When you're alone in the room, the way you act, that is you. That is authentically you. And when we go up on stage, maybe there's a little bit of a different version of us because now there's an audience. Now there's people watching. There's a little bit more pressure. Think about our moms, our parents, right? We saw them at their most you. My mom is a single mom growing up. It was me, my mom, my brother, and my little sister and I. And we saw my mom as she was, like her most authentic self. And that is because even if she wanted to escape us, she couldn't escape us, right? We were there all the time with her. And that is who my mom was then, right? But then when you go out into the world and you have to either assimilate or you have to kind of say, okay, well, I need this job. Sure, pay me pennies for it, right? In those situations, those almost feel out of your control. So again, the reflection piece is so important to how we show up as public speakers, understanding where our triggers are, why we show up the way that we do, where the pressures of this all come to be is so important to elevating ourselves and our communities. Areli mentioned using your voice, even if it shakes. And that is so true because the more you use your voice, the more comfortable you become with it. Right? And yeah, there may be some instances where maybe it's met with resistance and that pulls you back 2 steps, but then you can keep coming back up that 1 step. Sandra, thank you for sharing your experiences. How many times have we been made to feel, that our voices don't matter? That even if we do use our voices, it's not going to be heard and nothing is actually going to happen as a result of having used our voices. Think about the spaces that we're a part of, and this happens at home. It can happen at home. But then when we go out into the world, like college, we're first generation, or you're just going to college for the first time, and it's an intimidating experience, even when you go to grad school, when you go into your real, like, big person job, when you go out into the world, it's just not the same. And there are things, unfortunately, that are make up part of our society that make us feel like our voices just don't matter. So how do we continue to pull away from that? One of the tools that I use is public speaking. When I'm up on stage, when I get the opportunity to be up on stage, I have the mic. No one can take that mic away from me, and I can say whatever I want and have the impact that I want. And that's why I'm such an advocate for us to engage in the art of public speaking. And I wholeheartedly believe that once we discover our love for it, we're going to love it forever. And we're going to realize that actually public speaking has the ability to not only change our lives, but as a result, change the lives of other people too. And I want to thank my baby cousin. She's not a baby no more, but I want to thank my baby cousin Katie for coming on this segment and sharing. She has a very unique perspective. She is second to youngest in her family out of 4, and she's the only girl. And you already know what that's like, or can imagine. But she expressed some of it and shared some of it in this segment here. And I'm just appreciative because, it's sort of oftentimes easier to talk about this stuff that impacts how we show up in the world with other people that aren't in your immediate family, sometimes even strangers. And by strangers, I mean someone that you maybe, met online or whatever it is. Sometimes it's easier to have these conversations and to expose your thoughts with other people. And when it's time to do it with family, or when it's time to share with family, it feels awkward. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but it definitely feels that way for me sometimes. So thank you, Katie, for sharing and for just openly sharing your experiences. I'm super proud of you and the person that you've now become. Like, if we could talk about just how much she's breaking those generational cultural kind of norms, or broken those norms, we could be here for days. So thank you so much for sharing, and I'm so happy that you were a part of this. To end this segment, I want us to hear from Enzo about community, about being different. And I want to thank you for joining us in this segment of the Chats with Yvonne podcast. I hope that at the very least, you were able to connect with some of these lived experiences and realize that we're not alone in feeling these things, that actually we do have an entire community waiting and wanting to be here for us.
Community was and continues to be extremely important for me, right? Especially when we're unlearning all these things, right? Like, I myself, right, have been subjected to machismo. And on the flip end, right, as a trans masculine person, I too have perpetuated machismo, right? Because that is what I thought I needed to do in order to affirm my masculinity, right? And so it's like, yeah, I've had, have my friends like call me in or have conversations with me and be like, like, this was out of pocket, or like, I think you can do better, right? I think at the end of the day, it's like, I know you can do better. So let's talk about this, what you said or what you did. If you feel different, you're going to be different. And I think so much, there's so much pressure to like conform and be like, my parents have given me so much and I'd like to repay them. So I have to abide, right, by these expectations. But I think, embrace it. Know that if you feel different, you can rebirth yourself, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to abandon all those things you grew up with, but you can, right, give birth to yourself with all the gems, right, that you grew up with, and learn to release the things that told you that, you weren't valuable or worthy because you were different. I've been many different people, many different versions of myself throughout the years. And yeah, my ideas, my principles of what I think community means, what it means to have a meaningful relationship with others, has changed. And so, yeah, like, know that where you are, wherever you're at, is, who you want to be. Like, surround yourself with those folks, right? Just get used to existing in the subliminal.
Thank you again so much for joining me. Go out there and reinvent yourself as many times as you need to. There is no wrong, right way to do it. Thank you for joining us. I hope that this has inspired you to look deeper within yourself, but to also dive deep into the art of public speaking. I'll see you next time.